Come Saturday this week, Korea marks the start of a long weekend to celebrate Seollal, the Lunar New Year, which falls on January 22nd this year. So what are some of the traditional practices observed on this day? And which ones will be included in Korea's intangible heritage list? How are current economic hardships affecting celebration preparations? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we delve into Seollal celebrations as Korea looks ahead to the Lunar New Year this coming weekend. For more, I have Kwon Soa here in the studio. Soa, welcome back.
Happy to be here.
I also have Professor David Tizzard from Seoul Women's University with us here in the studio as well. It's a pleasure to have you here, Professor.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Right, so we'll start with you. For the sake of our viewers who may not be familiar with Korean culture, let's start with a few words on what a typical Seollal celebration looks like, Soa.
All right, so first off, what is Seollal? Seollal is one of the two major national holidays in Korea, along with Chuseok, which is in autumn, the Korean version of Thanksgiving. So Seol is when the Lunar New Year begins, and that's when everyone tells each other, 새해 복 많이 받으세요. That sounded very, that kind of sounded very foreign. Which literally means I wish you lots of fortune in the new year, or it's just a way to say Happy New Year. So in Korea, you hear 새해 복 많이 받으세요 a lot of times because you also say it at the beginning of the Gregorian calendar New Year. Now, Seollal this year falls on January 22nd, a Sunday. Usually the holidays last 3 days, the day before New Year or Lunar New Year, and then Seollal, the New Year itself, and the day after. And as Seol falls on a Sunday, we get off until Tuesday this time. And what's done? Families and relatives get together, which means a lot of traveling to hometowns. And the tradition is that families and relatives gather at the so-called 큰 집, which would literally translate into big house, and that's the house of the eldest son or oldest brother's house. Some families, however, take turns in hosting the ceremony. And there's the custom of 세배 that you do on 설날, which is bowing to your parents or grandparents, so the older generations. And then they tell you some nice words, some good words, which is referred to as 덕담 in Korean. And you would hear something like, have a healthy year, study well, stuff like that. And then the children usually receive 세뱃돈, which is pocket money. Also, you bow to your ancestors during an ancestral rite called 차례, and there you have a 차례상 or a 차례 table with dishes, fruits, and liquor served according to specific rules. And the Lunar New Year dishes usually include 전, which is a pan-fried dish. You could say a Korean-style pancake, but it's nothing sweet. It's usually savory kind of a pancake. And then you also have the main dish, 떡국, or rice cake soup. That's sliced circular rice cake inside a broth, which usually comes with slices of beef and egg and kim and vegetable. It's really difficult to explain those Korean dishes in English, but I hope you saw it through some of our footage there as well. So usually when you eat the 떡국, you say that you gain a new year of age, or that you're going to again have fortune this year. And it's similar to miyeokguk, a seaweed soup that you eat on your birthday in Korea. That also means that you gain a year of age. Although this year maybe will be rather remembered as the year we did not get older, because the new administration is going to adopt the universal age system. But in Korea, usually you gain a year right after the new year begins. So yes, apart from eating, also traditional games are played like yunori, and that's a traditional game in Korea where you play with sticks that you throw in the air. And yes, I won't go into the details there.
Right, and before we turn to Professor Tizzard though, so I understand there's a proper way of doing the 세배. Like a proper way of placing your hands and your feet before you do the 세배, right?
Right. So although you do it every year, actually I also refer to videos to make sure if I'm doing it right. So if you're a man or a boy, the male usually put their left hand on the right hand when they do the bow, and then they put their hands up to about their eye level. And also there's a rule when you get down to your knees, you touch the left knee first and then the right knee. And then for the female counterparts, it's the right hand that goes on the left hand. And when they get down to their knees, it's actually the same. The left knee first and then the right knee.
Okay, hopefully I'll do that properly this year.
Yes, but if you're confused, just check out on YouTube. You have a lot of videos that show you that.
Right, thank you for letting us know. All right, Professor Tizzard, you've been here in Korea for quite a while, almost 20 years. Is there a particular Seollal cultural custom that you find rather intriguing or interesting?
I think I find them all intriguing, just as they've been described, as the food, the ceremonies. Just to perhaps play out a couple of them, I must say I'm looking forward to not aging this year, as was just mentioned. The first thing that I would say coming from the United Kingdom is that Seollal never falls on the same date. Because it's according to the lunar calendar, you're often looking, how many days off will we get? Is it in January? Is it in February? So it has this element of change. It's not a fixed date. It's not a set date. And that can really play with people's emotions. Is this a good year? Is this a bad year? When do we go back to work? That's something that I found rather interesting. Another thing that I've found rather interesting is the idea, it was mentioned briefly, of the chale, of this ancestor worship. And this shows you here how Korean people, traditionally at least, because I think we need to play out how culture is changing, they're not paying reverence to a spirit, to a god, to a celestial being perhaps, to a transcendent entity, but rather to their family, to their ancestors, to those of their lineage that have gone before them. And I've been fortunate enough to see this play out many times and gone through all the rituals of witch hand here and there, but it plays out differently in every family and household, I will say. But the practice of turning off the lights, calling those who are no longer with you and telling them, this is how our children are doing. This person is getting married. This person is graduating from university. This person still isn't married. And all of these conversations that might come out, that was quite different for me. I'd not really seen that before, and it certainly plays in to all of these ideas you'll see in textbooks about hyo, filial piety, about the reverence given to one's ancestors and one's family that are core tenets of Confucianism. And so you can see all those textbook ideas really being played out, I think, in Seollal. And just one last point, very quickly, you would also get the, as was mentioned with the different ceremonies for the man and the woman, you can also see there this separation, this yin and yang, this, it's not about everybody does the same thing. The separation is important in those particular ceremonies for some people.
Right, that is so true, Professor Tizzard. So with regard to chare now, consumer prices here in the country are hovering on the 5% range. And that being said, the cost of chare this year apparently is going to be a record high. Could you tell us a bit more about this and how are authorities here seeking to ease perhaps the hardship or the burden on purse strings?
Sure. So the cost of preparing a chare table for a family of 4 was estimated at 254,500 won, or roughly $206 at traditional markets, and that's up 4.1% from the year before. And this is according to a research by Korea Price Information. And when it comes to purchasing the items at a large retail places, at retailers, it's 359,741. That's $291, and that is up 2.1% from a year. So although the on-year increase is larger at traditional markets, it costs 41.4% more to buy your essential items at retail stores than at traditional markets. Now, according to KPI, the rate of increase alone might not be extremely high. Prices did hit an all-time high this year again. And if we take a closer look by item, prices of industrial products such as livestock, confectionery, processed foods such as flour, cooking oil went up, and that's largely affected by Russia's war in Ukraine, as global oil and grain, raw material prices all increased. But prices of agricultural products such as fruits, nuts, and vegetables have fallen, and that's thanks to increased production. Dried persimmons and jujube costs also decreased due to a rise in imports. And then we've got the namul, which is the vegetables that you usually cooked and seasoned during the Seol festivities. In terms of those, you've got spinach prices that went down, but then gosari, which is translated into fiddleheads, I think gosari prices went up, so there's a mix of which some of the numbers went up, some down. So what is the government's efforts now in easing the financial burden for the people? Temporary customs clearance of imported goods that are high in demand during Seol started on January 9th to stabilize prices ahead of the holidays. And the government also announced to supply an unprecedented 208,000 tons of 16 key Lunar New Year food items, provide discounts on agricultural, livestock, fisheries products worth 30 billion won. And also, just like last year, the anti-graft law, or what we also know as Kim Young-nan Act, is to be temporarily eased for 30 days until January 27th to raise the value of the Lunar New Year gift to 200,000 won. And some other measures that the government is thinking of is an exemption of expressway tolls, because during the COVID period, when the pandemic was the worst, they actually did receive the toll fees so that they can make people not travel much during the Seollal holidays, but this time that's not going to be the case. And one last thing is a reduction of electricity and gas bills during that period as well.
Right, that is good to know then. Professor Tizzard, this is something you touched upon earlier as well, but speaking within your capacity as a scholar, what do you suppose are perhaps the broader implications of these Seollal practices, including chare and sebe?
I think there's a very interesting idea that we might look at, which is Yangbanhwa, or translated into English as Yangbanisation. This is an idea that comes from Professor Chang Kyung-seop, and what he suggests is that more and more people in modern South Korea, it might be decreasing now, but are acting like the Yangban of days of yore. In the Joseon dynasty, not everybody was a Yangban. There was a very clear caste system, and you would have had a series of scholars, literati, you would have had the middle class, you'd have also had a section of slaves. And so the practices, the formal language, the study, these ceremonies, they would have been laid out for certain people in society, most necessarily the Yangban. Now what we see in modern South Korea is we see everybody doing it. We see everybody now using honorific language. We see everybody now wanting to lay out these tables. Not everybody, religious arguments might come into those who do and don't do it, but Professor Chang Kyung-seop would see this, the implications of this is more and more people in modern South Korea are becoming like the Yangban of age. So Yangbanisation hasn't necessarily died out with traditional society. It's actually increasing and coming into modern society. And we're being described here the prices and the financial requirements to lay all these things out. If you're a member of the landed gentry and you get rent from the lands that you own or something, that's quite easy. If you're not, it's a little bit harder to keep up with the Joneses or to keep up with the Kims.
To say the least, of course.
Yeah, of course. So that's one of the things that I think is very interesting about what we're seeing play out here.
Right. Meanwhile, so with regard to chare late last year, one scholar, prior to the Chuseok holiday that would be, he claimed that our current chare table is way too extravagant. Could you tell us a bit more about his suggestions for a proper chare table, and why did it cause so much debate?
Right, that scholar was actually the head of the Seonggyeongwan Confucian Association, which is not the Seonggyeongwan University, but it is a state financed institution dedicated to preserving traditional Confucian culture. And he introduced a simplified version of the chare table for Chuseok, so not Seol, Chuseok being the Korean version of Thanksgiving, and during which also ancestors are being worshipped by preparing a chare sang. And the gist was that the pancake-like dish jeon and buchimge was not necessary on a chare table. So the head of the institution referred to ancient documentation that said it actually goes against the tradition to offer fried food to ancestors. So he offered a simplified guideline containing of a minimal of 6 items, which would be songpyeon, which is a special rice cake made for Chuseok, and then namul, which I mentioned before, cooked and seasoned vegetables, gui, which is grilled fish or meat, and then kimchi, fruits, and liquor. And if you want to add a little bit more, it could be other meat dishes, fish, and duck again, which is rice cake in general. Now, while the institution stressed that the ancestral rites were not about the extravagancy or a number of items that are served, but about the sincerity and families showing their respect to the ancestors. While saying that, he mentioned that the ancestors would not like to see their descendants feel stressed or even get into a quarrel during preparing the 차례상. So rather than having that, it's better to have a simplified version. Now, this new memorial service table has been welcomed by some, but not so much by others. Some people are saying the modern simplified table is a good idea to avoid the so-called holiday syndrome or 명절 증후군 here in Korea, and also ease discrimination. Discrimination referring to, the women having to, prepare all of this in the kitchen while the men just eat what's being served, for instance. So we've had that for many years, that many women are especially stressed during this period. And there's been also figures that showed that the divorce rate even, went up during that period. So there's some that are in favor of this simplified version, although it's not a rule, it's just a recommendation that's been made last year. But then there are others that say the institution is being desperate because they want the tradition to continue no matter what, while more and more people do not hold the rituals at all anymore. So to preserve that, they are just simplifying it, is what others are saying or criticizing.
Right. Professor Tizzard, as Soa has just mentioned, statistics do show that after Seollal celebrations, there is a tangible rise in divorce rates, amid conflict, of course, with regard to the workload of the holiday that falls largely on the women. How do you respond to this reality, speaking as the only man in the studio right now?
I'll also speak as a person, as a human being to you rather than a man. But we were talking here about the dishes and how much should be placed on table and how the workload should fall. And so I'd like us to consider how culture changes. Now, culture might be understood in one way as a symbiotic relationship between material resources, behavior, and values. The material resources of South Korea in the 21st century, in 2023, are very different from hundreds of years ago when we're looking at these records, when they say there should be no fried food. They're very different from the 70s and 80s when I first arrived, people would still ask me, have you eaten today? Is this old expression about, have you had enough food? Food is in abundance in modern South Korea. I know not everybody's rich, but you can get whatever you want. Time and space doesn't exist in this modernity society. You can get strawberries any time of year, more or less. You can go to a supermarket and you can get these things. So they're changing. Resources are changing. That means behavior are changing. You asked about divorce rates. How does that work? Well, now more and more women have financial independence. More and more people are educated. And so their resources in terms of qualifications, in terms of money, in terms of material possessions, they're not reliant. So their behavior is changing. As their behavior changes, also their values change. They want equality, they want independence. And I think there's this real interesting conversation that has to come between traditional society and modern society. Can we cherry pick elements of traditional society and bring it all and update it? Or is it a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater? It's very difficult because the traditional society finds value in ideas like 부부유별, the man and the woman are separate, that relationships are hierarchical, that you speak with honorific language to those above you. How do we get some of those and update them to modern society? There's still a lot of value in them, but when we see this coming together between tradition and modernity, it doesn't surprise me that sometimes divorce rates might go up or there might be struggles. I wouldn't necessarily, just to finish, put that down solely to holidays like Seollal, but I think it's the modernizing process which is coming. And some people even might say that that's a good sign, these divorce rates. People are now finding their freedom. I'm not advocating divorce to anyone, but it might be now that people are able to find their own path.
Right, and speaking about finding their own path,
So another unfortunate reality is that the young here in Korea, young Koreans, are actually shunning these family gatherings that take place on Seollal and even Chuseok. Could you tell us a bit about that as well?
Right, a lot of this has got to do with the stress that young people get from relatives that swarm them with questions once you get together with your large families. I mean, which you can understand if you get together just once or twice a year, then it's kind of obvious that you would receive a lot of questions, but in many cases, they are job-related or relationship and marriage-related. And according to a survey, 6 in 10 Koreans said they wanted to spend Lunar New Year holiday alone. And some of them say their level of stress is even higher when they receive those questions from their relatives than the actual stress they are receiving when they're looking for a job, for instance, or the stress level at their working place. And the questions that young Koreans hate were questions like, what are your plans for the future? When are you getting a job? And comments that start with, when I was your age, or we're just saying this for your own sake. So those are the typical questions that many families in Korea ask their children or grandchildren or nieces, whatever, when they get together. And this is why there is actually the 혼설족, which we have that hun culture in Korea that's been spreading, meaning if you do something alone. 혼밥 means eating alone, and 혼설족 is those people who would like to spend Lunar New Year alone at home.
Right, away from those intrusive questions then. Professor Tizzard, on a bright note now, there are efforts here in the country to designate a number of our Seollal traditions as intangible cultural assets here in the country. What are your thoughts on the relevance of such initiatives?
I think by doing so, it's confining those elements like the bowing, the sepe, it's confining them to history. Now, here we go. This might be a little bit touchy, but some people might tell me the hanbok is Korean culture, the traditional dress, and the hanok, the traditional house. But if I look in Korean society, I don't see any of those things. I believe culture is what people do. Culture is what people enact. There might be traditional cultures, but I think Korean culture is very dynamic. It's changing all the time. Korean culture today seems to be defined by trips abroad, jeans and hoodies and apartment living. There is this idea, as just was being said, Latin and Malia, back in my day, this is the way it was. And some people want to preserve the culture they experienced when they were in their 20s or 30s. And that's nice and that's human nature, but it's not allowing the young people to live their culture. Now, it's not our job to necessarily tell them what their culture should be, but as I said before, they have different resources, they have different values, and so therefore they'll carry out different behaviors according to those situations. I think it's good if they try to make these things cultural heritages, but I think what they are doing is they're saying that people don't really want to do that these days. They're doing other things. And I think we shouldn't necessarily be scared of these new things. Not all new things are good, not all change is necessary, but I think we have to be cognizant of the new Korea, the Korea that is coming, and a Korea for the future.
Right, I see. And staying with that, so very briefly speaking, could you tell us a bit more about this campaign to list some of our cultural customs as intangible assets?
Sure. So the Cultural Heritage Administration last week announced plans to designate such customs like the Seol or bow and visits to graves as national intangible cultural properties in September, after they're going to complete some research on the value of holidays such as Lunar New Year and Chuseok, as well as some other traditions. So they're going to make that review, and then in December, actually last year, the administration held a meeting on these designations, and next year they even looking into making folk games like kite flying and oral folk tales, 구전설화, also as cultural assets. So more and more of these traditions are expected to be put on that list.
Right, following, of course, Talchum's designation within the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage last year. I see. All right, so as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Tizzard, it has been a pleasure having you here with us.
Thank you.
Right, well, on that note, we end Monday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time on Tuesday.